Okay. We, of course, are back to the Sermon on the Mount. And let's go back and read that key verse again. Would someone read Matthew 5, verse 20? That's kind of the hinge verse in this first chapter. Matthew 5, verse 20.
For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven.
All right. And he began the Sermon on the Mount, of course, talking about those qualities and characteristics that needed to be displayed in his followers, his disciples. And so, in verse 20, the key is that his disciples' righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. And we've talked in the past, the scribes and the Pharisees were only concerned about outward rituals. They were not concerned with their attitude, their motive, their heart. And so Jesus says both are essential. And so in those Beatitudes at the beginning of the sermon, he stressed the attitude and the spirit of the heart. So he talked about murder, adultery, marriage, honesty, going the second mile. And so at the end of this chapter 5, now he starts talking about the law of love. And he's going to do the same thing in this section he's done with the others, and that is show what exceeding righteousness is. So he begins. Verse 43. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And that, of course, is how he began each of these little sections. You have heard, you have heard, you have heard. And the same thing here. He says, you have heard. And in this case, now he starts talking about love. And what had been taught, what had been heard. And just like in the past, they would often just stress that outward action and pay no attention to the reason, the attitude behind it. He talked about this once again with murder and adultery and honesty and all of this. He does the same thing then with love. You have heard that it was said. So, let's go back to the Hebrew Scriptures and let's read Leviticus 19, verse 18. That'll get us started. If someone would read that, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18.
You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord.
All right. You're not to take vengeance. You're not to bear any grudge. But you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now notice when you read that, it does not say, and hate your enemy. I mean, it's just not there. But what happened over time was that this was what had occurred. And so by the time of Christ, the Jews pretty much hated everybody but their fellow Jews. And even though the Bible never taught that, over the centuries, that's what ended up being the case with these people. They ended up hating everybody but the Jews. They hated, the Samaritans, with the Good Samaritan story. All right. So they, ended up over time, and possibly this goes back to maybe, they were not to intermingle with any of the nations around them, and they might have taken that to mean, well, that means I should hate them. Well, God never said to hate them. So, if you're still in the Old Testament, go back to Exodus 23, and if someone would read verses 4 and 5.
If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall surely bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying under its burden, and you would refrain from helping it, you shall surely help him with it.
Okay. See, that seems to indicate that there's to be kindness toward your enemies. Even your enemies, farm animals. So if they were to show kindness to their enemies' farm animals, then certainly they needed to show kindness to their enemies. So, over time, that's what happened, was they ended up hating their enemies. And that's why in verse 43 it says, you have heard, because that's what many of the rabbis taught. You shall love your neighbor, meaning Jewish people, and hate everybody else. And that is what was taught by many of the rabbis. And how, sad that had to have been. So look at John chapter 4, verse 9. Someone would read that for us. This goes right along with this idea of enemies and what the Jews did. John 4, verse 9.
And the woman of Samaria said to him,
How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans.
Okay, there's just another example where by the first century the Jews didn't have anything to do with anybody else. Only Jews. So that's where verse 43 comes from. So Jews hated all foreigners, all non-Jews. So, verse 44, and this is the same pattern he's used throughout this sermon so far. He says, this is what you've heard. Verse 44 now says, but I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. So now, this is like taking the teaching to a brand new level. Now love was never to have any limits. See, love even, make sure your love toward men even goes as far as your enemies. And that's what he's stressing in. And of course here, love, the agape love, where you are concerned about the other's welfare. In other words, you want what's best for them. This is kind of called a higher love in the sense of this is not an emotional love. This is a love of action. This is a love of goodwill for other people. The will to do good to other people, regardless who those other people are. And that's the kind of good here. You want the other person to have good, all right? To do well. You wish the other person well. So that's the idea here when Jesus says, love your enemies. Do that. So, along with that, would someone read Luke chapter 6, verse 27? I think that just reinforces what we just said. Luke 6, verse 27.
But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you.
Do good to those who hate you. All right? So, that's just another account of Jesus saying basically the same thing. So, love your enemies, do good toward everybody, Okay, and of course he's going to reinforce this with the idea of that's how God is. In other words, God has this agape love for everybody that's ever lived, regardless of who they are. And so this is a godly characteristic. So not only do you love your enemies, but you bless those who curse you. This is the same idea. You want what is good for other people. All right? You want blessing instead of cursing upon them. You, those who hate you, you want to do some good toward them. You pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. You know, Jesus at the beginning, going back to the beginning of Matthew 5, verse 10, he says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake." So Jesus had already told his followers that persecution was going to be part of their lives. So, here's what he says. Love them, bless them, do good to them, and pray for them. All of that. That's what he wants all of them to do. Pray for them. All right. Notice these words. Luke 23, verse 34. Would someone read that for us? Luke 23, verse 34.
For they do not know what they do, and they divided his garments and cast lots.
Okay, of course, this is Jesus on the cross, but while he's being crucified before he dies. It says, you know, Father, forgive them. So he's doing good. He's blessing them, and these are his enemies. So Jesus was setting an example for us as to what to do. This is how he wants his followers to be. So in verse 45, he goes on and says, that you all, disciples, may be sons of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good. That's what he does on all of them. He's going to send rain. He's going to send good. This is, God shows his impartial love by sending rain to everybody. So let's go back a couple places in the Old Testament. Let's read Job 25, verse 3. And then somebody please read Psalm 65, 9 through 13.
What was Job?
25, 3.
Is there any number to his armies? Is that it?
I don't have it in front of me. Job 25, verse 3. Yeah.
Is there any number to his armies? Upon whom does his light not rise?
Yeah. In other words, his blessings go on everybody. Makes no difference. On everybody. There's nobody his blessings do not touch. And then Psalm 65, 9 through 13. If anybody has that, it goes kind of along with the same idea. 9 through 13.
You visit the earth and water it. You greatly enrich it. The river of God is full of water. You provide their grain, for so you have prepared it. You water its ridges abundantly. You settle its furrows. You make it soft with showers, and you bless its growth. You crown the year with your goodness, and your paths drip with abundance. They drop on the pastures of the wilderness, and the little hills rejoice on every side. The pastures are clothed with flocks. The valleys also are covered with grain. They shout for joy. They also sing. Okay, so our verse talks about God, shining his light on everybody and sending rain on everybody. So there's no place where God's blessings are not felt. And that's what he's stressing to these people here. So, he says that you may be sons of your Father in heaven.
So if you want to be like your Father in heaven, then you're going to practice this same type of love. This exceeding love, this love without limits love. That's what he's talking about here. Would someone right along with that read 1 John 4, verses 7 and 8. 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 and 8.
Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. And everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. The one who does not love does not know God, for God is love.
All right. Let us love one another. Why? Because love comes from God. And as he says, everyone that loves comes from God, is begotten of God. So, Jesus talks there in verse 44 that you may be sons, children of your Father in heaven. So there's the, if we're going to really be disciples, we're not just going to love people that we like. In other words, the love is going to go beyond just our close circle of family and friends. It's going to extend further. And of course, if we didn't love people's souls, we would never be involved in mission work or evangelistic work or personal work. The motive behind that is supposed to be this agape love for one another. So, he goes on in verse 46, for if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And that's exactly what they do, And of course, tax collectors at that time were considered to be crooked, evil, immoral, most of them. So he says, if the only people you love are the people that's like you, close family members or close neighbors or friends, if that's the only people you ever love, then you're not any better than those evil, corrupt, no good for nothing tax collectors. And that's why he uses that illustration of tax collectors. Do not even the tax collectors do the same? He says, don't expect a reward if your love is only for those you like. He says, God's not going to reward you if that's the only love you ever have. So don't expect it. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So, we are to do good. So, Galatians 6, verse 10. If someone would read that for us. Galatians 6, verse 10. Goes right along with this.
Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith.
Okay, so there he says, as you have opportunity. As you have opportunity, make sure you do good. You show love toward all people, regardless of whether that's your family or your friends or your neighbors or just the people you like. No, he says you have opportunity. You do it to everybody. So that's how important it is. So what reward do you have? You don't have any. And that's the same thing in verse 47. And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? One tax collector walking down the road sees another tax collector, greets him. Well, no one else is going to greet a tax collector because they were despised. So, one tax collector sees another one, they're going to say, hey, how you doing? Because no one else is going to. So, if these wicked, evil, corrupt tax collectors even greet one another, then you need to have a superseding love. Your love needs to be an example to the world that is different than how everybody else loves. There needs to be a more in our love. It needs to be greater than that, and that's what he's saying here. So therefore you shall be perfect just as your Father in heaven is perfect. And that's our goal. We see the Father sending blessings to everyone. We need to do the exact same thing. All right, so with that, let's go to Romans chapter 5, because this shows the extent of God's love for everybody. So Romans chapter 5. And let's see. Romans 5. Okay, verses 6 through 8, and then also verse 10. Someone read Romans 5, 6 through 8, and also verse 10.
For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life.
See, and there's the example of what God did. You know, while we were his enemies, while we were sinners, while we were no good, what did he do? He sent his Son. And his Son didn't die just for good people. In due time, Christ died for the ungodly. So that shows the extent of the love. And so, you know, just as your Father in heaven, all right, just as your Father in heaven does, you're to do likewise, he says. You know, follow that example, just like the Father is. He's our goal, our model. Of course, we never obviously measure up to that extent, but the idea is that, you know, that's our aim and our goal. He's like the bullseye, and we try, you know, getting closer and closer to the bullseye by showing this kind of love, not being like the priest and the Levite in the story of the Good Samaritan who just saw the guy and walked by. No, we go out of our way to help. That's the idea. We go out of our way. So this type of love, it's deliberate. It comes from your mind. You know, I don't know if you want to use the word intelligent, but that's what it is. It's not based on emotions or feelings. All right, you determine to do this type of love. So it's not the phileo type of love with friends and family, or the type of love with husbands and wives. No, this is a type of love that's based on knowing to do what is right, and you're going to do it regardless of who the person is. That's the idea. And so that's why, going back to Matthew 5:20, this is the righteousness that exceeds the scribes and Pharisees. The scribes and Pharisees would only love basically themselves, people just like them, other scribes and Pharisees. They didn't love anybody else. So Jesus says yours has to go beyond that, has to exceed it, has to supersede it. That's the kind of love you've got to have. Not like the scribes and Pharisees. That doesn't do any good. It's an exceeding righteousness. And that's New Testament Christianity is an exceeding righteousness. It's to go beyond. And so when you look at any other type of religion or faith or whatever, Christianity, the real Christianity in the New Testament, is supposed to be one that exceeds. All right? It's like he had just mentioned going the second mile. All right? That's an exceeding Christianity. And that's what we're supposed to be like. We're to imitate God. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1. Someone read that, because that's this idea of imitating God.
Therefore, be imitators of God as dear children.
Okay, imitators. Imitate God. All right? Just like, little children imitate their fathers, then we're children, like he just mentioned, sons of your Father in heaven. So we're to imitate him. What does he do? He sends blessings upon everybody. Rain and sun and everything else. So we're to imitate him. And so this kind of love is a love that starts inside, all right? It's one that we know what's good, we know what we should do, we know what's right, we know what God wants us to do, and so that's what we do. We need to have the right attitude in this type of love. And that's this exceeding type of love that he's been talking about over and over again. It's an exceeding type of love. Not like the scribes and Pharisees. All right. Anybody have anything to add to that? Because that's kind of ends chapter 5. And we'll get into chapter 6, Lord willing, next week, when we talk about pleasing God, and then look at the model prayer.